2 undergrads and postgrads in the area of linguistics, cognitive science, statistics, and psycholinguistics. He completed his PhD in 2011 from IIIT Hyderabad, and subsequently from 2011 to 2014, he was a postdoc researcher at Lab, University of Boston, Germany. His current research investigates the sources of sentence complexity, such as working memory, orthography, grammatical representation, and parsing strategy, during real-time language comprehension and production using behavioral, corpus-based, as well as computational methods. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me, Kavita, for this workshop. Let me just quickly share my screen again. So I hope this is visible, and I'll just quickly make it. So is this good? Can you see the screen now?
Yes, sir, it's visible.
Okay, so let me, just a sec. Okay, I think this is fine. All right, so I am basically a psycholinguist who basically conducts experiments to understand how adults comprehend language. And my aim today would be to use that research and see if I can connect it to children, how children comprehend language. And my hope would be to then to basically highlight these issues, which can then perhaps be relevant for the theme of the workshop, right? And I'll talk about that briefly, right? So in the slide we can see basically 3 sentences, right? So you have the postman gave a book to the child. The postman gave to the child a book, and the child was given a book by the postman. Now, what is quite clear, and it's sort of in fact trivial, that the same sentence can be spoken in multiple ways, right? And language actually allows us to do that, right? So you have here 3 options which somebody who is trying to encode this information can choose to use, right? And so, but the key point that I would like to stress and talk about is that, well, there are certain options which are more difficult, and let us probably take a look at what are those kinds of sentences which cause problem, and what are the sentences which are kind of okay. So here's another sentence: the postman who met you gave a book to the child. The postman who you met gave a book to the child, right? So so in the first sentence, basically, of course, these 2 are distinct sentences. Nevertheless, intuitively, if I ask you which sentence is easier and which sentence is more difficult, I suppose you will be able to give some answer. And what will turn out that if you are a near native English speaker or a person who knows decent English, your answer and the other people giving the answer for this kind of a sentence would match, right? So there's consistency across various speakers, right, of what is deemed as complex and what is not deemed as complex. So the question that I'm trying to sort of get at is, why is a sentence complex? That is the question that I'm trying to get at. And what I am trying to suggest is that, well, sentence complexity, right? If we are able to answer this question of why a sentence is complex, there's a whole bunch of things which sort of it helps us understand. It could help us understand about language acquisition. For example, it could sort of tell us, well, are there certain patterns in language which are easy versus patterns which are difficult? It can tell us about grammar itself. It can tell us about language change and variation. And what we are focused on today really is, well, it tells us something about how people process language, right? What are the different kinds of cognitive constraints or cognitive resources which are employed or which are sort of strained um, when we understand certain kinds of sentences, right? And in the context of today's workshop, I mean, or the workshop that we are part of, um, I think what is relevant is that, at least what I would like to think is that, well, when we are talking about learning, right? Learning happens, of course, via various activities, but language is one of the main ways in which we impart some knowledge. And it therefore becomes critical to really understand what kind of sentences and what kind of ways, what how do these concepts get encoded in language when we teach to students, right? To especially to kids. And so, understanding or appreciating this research about syntactic complexity, which is sort of one of the key areas in psycholinguistics, can help us make certain more informed decisions about pedagogy, as well as about how we basically think about learning uh, in the in for various concepts in schools and so on. So, so my aim basically in the next 30 minutes or so would be to help you appreciate that, well, there are certain kinds of constraints and there are kinds of sentences which are difficult to understand. And then I'll start with adults, right? What we know about adults, a brief snapshot of what we know from the research. What does it tell us about the comprehension system? And then I will try and compare that base to how children basically understand language. Is there a difference or is there a similarity and so on, right? And hopefully together, this gives us a sense of what kinds of research in this domain might be useful in the for the themes in the workshop. So the sources of complexity are varied, right? They could be related to how things are written. It could be related to what is called as morphology in linguistics, the small bits of pieces which sort of occur either before or at the end, for example, in various languages. So when you say eats, the S is part of encode certain information, which basically is analyzed at a certain level, which is called morphological analysis. It also the source of complexity can arise because of the grammar, because of the meaning, and so on. What I'm going to focus on is basically the complexity which arises from the structure of the sentence, right? In terms of, well, you could call it grammar informally, but that's what I'm going to focus on. And a key consideration in our discussion would be working memory, right? Or the fact that human computational resources, right, are limited, right? They're not infinite. We know from cognitive psychology that the system gets trained under a variety of circumstances, and so right and that knowledge or that sort of research has come into psycholinguistics and sort of is used to inform us about the interaction between language processing and its sort of its reliance on the larger cognitive architecture, the larger cognitive constraints. So here is a very famous example from Prayer and Rayner, and this is a sentence which basically says, while Susan was dressing, the baby played on the floor, right? And perhaps you could take a look at this sentence, and I don't know if you find it difficult, but compare this sentence with with sentence 2, which is, while Susan was dressing herself, the baby played on the floor, right? And what people have found very early in research in sentence processing is that, well, sentences like 3A tend to be slightly difficult for adults, English native speakers, compared to 3B, right? And one reason why that is because there is this phrase here, right, the baby, which can which can, temporarily speaking, right, while we are reading, can either go with the verb dressing, or it could be basically treated as a start of something new, right? So you could either say the while Susan was dressing the baby, or I mean, grammatically, you can also say while Susan was dressing, stop, the baby played on the floor, which is in fact the intended um, uh, meaning, right, or the structure for 3A. It becomes quite apparent in 3B because, well, we have explicitly stated herself. Now, so the key point in 3A is that we don't know, at least locally, where the clause is going to end, right? At dressing or at the baby, right? Whereas there is no such ambiguity in 2. And these kinds of sentences, basically, right? And when you try and, so these are locally ambiguous sentences, and when you try and understand how people sort of comprehend these systems, these kinds of sentences in real time, like I said, people find that, well, sentences like A here are more difficult than 4B. And the difficulty is, is seen at the verb played, right? In for example, A versus B, and what basically tells us, right, the fact that there is a difficulty in processing played here. It basically tells us that that the human sentence processing system is incremental in nature, right? Which is that you don't wait for the entire sentence or all of the information to actually arrive before you start making sense of what the sentence is all about, right? So in that sense, it's very greedy. It has a very greedy approach, right? It basically, you have local information and you make sense of that local information at the cost of being wrong, really, right? So we don't wait. We take the decision, and which is supposedly efficient. Ambiguity itself is not costly, which is right. It's basically the fact that, well, you made a mistake, right, which leads to a certain difficulty, right. That is of relevance here, right. We make wrong choices when we read, when we hear things, we misunderstand things. In this case, you might say that, well, the problem is local, and by the time you reach at played, you realize that, well, you've made a mistake, and so therefore you've done some revision, and that of course gets reflected as a processing cost, right? But this kind of a right. So this is a sort of a linguistic structure for this sentence where it's shown that, well, if you attach baby with dressing, well, you don't have any subject for played, and this is sort of an ungrammatical. It's not allowed in English, right? And therefore you need to do certain things, right? And this doing certain extra revision leads to this extra cost that you see while doing experiments, right? So these kind of temporary ambiguous sentences are called Guardpath sentences, very well researched. These are temporarily ambiguous. They are harder to understand than their unambiguous counterparts, which basically means that they take longer to read. And it also means that if you were to have such a sentence and ask questions about it, people make more mistakes in such sentences. So for example, for the sentence that we just saw, while Susan was dressing, the baby played on the floor. If you ask people, well, was Susan dressing the baby? A lot of people might say yes, right? Which is an incorrect answer because, well, Susan was not dressing the baby. The baby actually was part of a separate event. But people make mistakes, right? So this is an important point for us here, right? The other aspect that I would like to highlight is that when there is an ambiguity, these kinds of local ambiguity, right? Humans, adult humans, of course, tend to rely on a variety of linguistic knowledge or a variety of knowledge base to basically help them disambiguate whatever ambiguity exists there, right? So you have a sentence here: the burglar blew up the safe with a rusty lock versus the burglar blew up the safe with a dynamite, right? Now, the ambiguity here, structurally speaking, it turns out that if you were to give this sentence to adult English native speakers, sentences like 6A are more difficult than 6B, right? And this is because it turns out that there is this default preference where people try and attach or relate this prepositional phrase with a rusty lock with blew up, the verb, right? And because there is this preference for this kind of a attachment where you take this prepositional phrase and attach it to the VP or the verb phrase, this kind of a strategy works for is a correct strategy in case of a sentence like B, where the burglar blew up the safe with a dynamite, but it turns out to be incorrect in the case of 6A. Correct? But then what people have found, right? What people have found that, well, sure, if you give these kinds of sentences in isolation, right? These are 6A could be more difficult than 6B. But then if you provide more information to the participants, right? If you who are reading these sentences, then this kind of a difficulty can go away. So for example, if I give you a story where I precede this sentence with a story where there are there are two safes in the story. One safe is lying outside the garage or whatever, and the other safe is basically and it's sort of rusting, and the other safe is inside, which is brand new. And then when I say that the burglar blew up the safe with a rusty lock, adults don't seem to find the sentence difficult anymore, because the story has two sort of safes. This prepositional phrase is then used to choose the right safe out of the two safes which are there in the story, right? And so suddenly, because of this new knowledge that we have, we find that, well, this kind of a decision of where to attach this prepositional phrase becomes easy, right? And so there are numerous theories out there which basically try and understand what are the different factors which can help resolve these ambiguities. We have talked about one here, which is the world knowledge, right? Discourse or the story context that we have. But there are other things which relate to the properties of the verb. It could relate to how we speak, and so on. It can help those kinds of knowledge can help resolve the ambiguity which is inherent in these kinds of sentences, right? So moving on, there's another set of sentences. We've of course talked about ambiguity, and there's a lot of research on ambiguity. The key point, the key takeaway for us is that, well, even a simple sentence can be ambiguous, right? Because, well, local information is always used to take a decision. And in a local context, you can basically, because you don't wait for the entire sentence, you can make mistakes, right? And in order to resolve a certain kind of ambiguity which exists locally, humans or adult humans basically rely on different sources of information. But then additionally, there's another strand of research which basically tries to understand, well, what is comprehension like when sentences are supposedly non-ambiguous or not ambiguous, basically, right? And this relates to certain processes that are at play when we say that, well, the sentence is getting understood, right? So one of the key things that we have to appreciate is that when we say the sentence has been understood, there's a whole bunch of steps that is required to be undertaken from hearing an utterance to meaning, or reading a sentence to meaning, right? And the key thing to appreciate here is that one of those steps is where we relate multiple words in a sentence with each other in a meaningful way, or grammatical, in a way which is grammatical, right? And so those steps, wherein we relate a verb with a subject, a verb with an object, and other kinds of dependencies, syntactic dependencies, will require certain computational resources, right? And this strand of research tries to understand, well, what are those computational, what are those steps which are easier, and what are those steps which are difficult, right? So let me, right? So this is basically where we can appreciate the word, um, the requirement for temporary working sort of memory. So we've just talked about the fact that, well, sentence processing is incremental and it's immediate. So therefore, one implication of this is that, well, because you take a step, you basically start building things um, in an incremental fashion, and without waiting for future information, sometimes you will have to retain partial information in order to be able to make use of it in the future, right? What do I mean by that? So imagine that there is a sentence like, this weekend we bought a toy that Abhay really hoped Deepika would like, right? In this sentence, if everybody understands this sentence, but one of the key reasons why we are able to understand this sentence is that we are able to relate like with toy, right? It's, what would Deepika like? She would like a toy, right? But then if you think about it, from a listener's point of view, toy has already occurred in the past. So the toy has been read or heard in the past, and it's quite distant from the position where you basically hear like, right? And so in order for you to make sense of this sentence, therefore, right, you have, in order to establish these two dependencies, you basically have to reactivate this toy from the past and bring it out, right? And this requires utilization of working memory, right? And as you can imagine, right, this is not something special, right? We do this all the time. So the key point of this example is to appreciate that, well, sentence processing is intimately tied to utilization of different resources, for example, working memory. Of course, when we are reading, right, we are also utilizing our eyes, right? So the physiology of the eye and the way has evolved in humans will have a huge role to play, or it will have basically interact with the sentence processing system, correct? So this kind of a usage where, you retain certain things and then bring it out later for establishing these kinds of relationship is pretty common in language, but we have to appreciate that, right? One implication, right, of this kind of a relationship, establishing this relationship, is this idea of locality, right? Which basically means that, well, if I have to relate two syntactically related sort of connected words in a dependency, right? For example, a subject and a verb, then because there is a requirement for retrieval from working memory in order to establish this kind of a relationship, I better keep these things together or close to each other. And the constraint which is called as locality, right? And right, because the dependent has to be established, it has to be retrieved from the working memory, uh, which sort of, right, because if I increase this distance, then the dependent might decay in memory, right? You might forget what you have to retrieve from the working memory. Um, and so, right, so the more intervening material you have between two related words, the worse, the idea that it should basically become worse for you to, as far as processing is concerned. correct? And so an example is given in 8A to B, A to C, which is that the administrator who the nurse supervised scolded the medic versus the administrator who the nurse from the clinic supervised scolded the medic versus the administrator who the nurse who was from the clinic supervised scolded the medic. So what is happening here is, of course, that the distance between the supervised, which is one of the verbs which we are interested in, relating it to administrator becomes more and more difficult because the distance between the two increases from A to C, right? This basically is this idea is coming from this theory by Ted Gibson, dependency locality theory, where the key point is that, well, if two things are related, you should keep them close to each other, right? And reading time or comprehension difficulty would be a function of distance in this context, right? Similar. So, for example, in this case, the reporter who the senator attacked admitted the error versus the reporter who attacked the senator admitted the error. Clearly, intuitively, you will say that 9B is easier than 9A. Well, that is because one way to think about it is because reporter and attacked are closer to each other in 9B, whereas reporter and attacked are further away in 9A, right? And this is a pretty um, established sort of manipulation or phenomena that has been observed in English. And in fact, this is a slightly, I don't know if it's a transparent graph or not, but this is taken from Futrell et al. 2015, which basically establishes that, well, dependency length minimization, the fact that on average, two syntactically related words are close to each other is in fact a universal, and you see this across all languages, or well, all the languages which were investigated, which was around 32 languages, right, of different kinds, including a language like Hindi, Telugu, Tamil, right, which are very much spoken in the subcontinent. Correct. So the working memory literature tells us that there are two aspects to these kinds of properties. One is related to the idea of decay, which we just discussed, that as you increase the distance, or time, things become difficult to retrieve because of the fact that, well, certain entities which are there, their activation can decay. Right. The other thing which has been very nicely been documented in the literature, right, is the idea of interference, which is that two related words, right, of a certain kind can basically lead to processing costs. So in this case, it's sentences, it was the barber that saw the lawyer in the parking lot versus it was the right? So it was the barber that Bill saw in the parking lot. So the idea is that, well, when these words, if you have a barber and lawyer, if you have John and Bill, right, which have similar semantic properties, then suddenly the processing cost can increase, right? If they are distinct semantically, for example, if you use barber here and Bill inside, then it becomes easier, right? So the idea of interference is coming from the fact that, well, if we are looking at a sentence, trying to understand a sentence, then previously attended words, if they're very similar to each other, then they will cause problem in the future, right? If the sentence has distinct words, it is good, right? That is what has been observed. Okay, so let's look at another very interesting phenomena, which is kind of, this is a crazy sentence, right? The apartment that the maid who the service had sent over was cleaning every week was well decorated, right? And frankly, these kinds of sentences are called center embedded structures. And if we break it down, the sentences, the apartment was well decorated, that's the main sentence. And then you have the apartment that the maid was cleaning every week, was well decorated, and so on, right? So it's like there is a noun which is related to a verb, which is a V1, which is the outermost verb. And there's an embedding, another clause within that, which is represented by V2, N2, which is related to V2. And within that, there's another clause, which is N3, which is related to V3, right? And the fact is that, well, as you can imagine, the system completely breaks down for these kinds of sentences, right? So if I give you another sentence, the apartment that the maid who the service had sent over was well decorated. And if I give you these two sentences and ask you to, well, rate which sentence is better, native speakers of English rate 12 better than 11, although 12 is an ungrammatical sentence, right? Which basically means that, well, not much is happening as far as the processing system is concerned, right? There's a complete breakdown um, of comprehension here. And this is related to the fact that, well, there's a lot of dependency that has to be established, and working memory limitation. It tells you that, well, these kinds of structures which are center embedded are difficult to understand, right? So there's a lot of computation that needs to be happening, right? So basically what we are getting at is that, well, these kinds of structures are kind of difficult, partly, and they sort of reflect the fact that, well, there are certain kinds of limitations that we have in the cognitive sort of resources that we employ during sentence processing. Correct. And there's a whole bunch of other kind of structures, right, that we can talk about related to filler gap dependencies, right extraposition, heavy NP shift, very well documented, all relating to the idea of memory constraints and processing load. I guess the key takeaway for us, right, is that there's a whole variety of English sentences which are difficult, and they reflect either ambiguity or they reflect certain kinds of structural constraints, right? And right, and there are in fact certain resources now which document these kinds of different kinds of complex sentences. Another interesting last one here, this kind of an ambiguity, which is the coach smiled at the player tossed a frisbee, where what happens is that, well, this sentence, if you look at this sentence, the coach smiled at the player who was tossed the frisbee, right? This is a reduced relative clause, and what people end up doing is that, well, people start forming a ungrammatical sentence where they believe that the player tossed a frisbee, which is that is not what it is. It's actually the right. It's actually the player, right, who was tossed the frisbee. Right, he's not the subject. So people also form these what are called locally coherent structures, which are not to be formed. This meaning should not be derived from this sentence, because it's not grammatical, but people do make such mistakes, right? So there's a whole bunch of mistakes that people do, right? Okay, so before I get to that, let me touch upon another sort of property of the comprehension system, which has to do with prediction. We have earlier talked about dependency resolution, the fact that, well, these two elements, any two elements, have to be related in a syntactic relationship when we are trying to get from a sentence to its meaning. One of the things that people have noticed is that, because we talked about incrementality, that we don't wait for the entire sentence to finish. One of the ways in which you can be efficient, right, in trying to make sense of the sentence is trying to predict what will come in the future, right? And adult native speakers are good at making such predictions, right? Right. So if you make the right prediction, then there'll be processing facilitation at the end. But of course, the flip side of this would be that if you make a wrong prediction, that would be costly. Or if you make a prediction and that prediction sort of um, doesn't is not satisfied because of certain delay, that might also create certain issues. So here is an example that we saw earlier again, right? Which is that the reporter who the senator attacked admitted the error versus the reporter who attacked the senator admitted the error. And what we find is that people slow down at the senator in 14A, right, compared to 14B, right? And this has been explained by the fact that, well, the sentences like B, 14B, are more frequent in English. These are subject relative clauses compared to 14A, right? And therefore, on average, when you see a who, right, English native speakers expect that it's going to be a subject relative clause, right? And when they do find that kind of a sentence, such as in 14A, they get surprised, right? It's sort of the fact that, well, I was not expecting this, and therefore I face certain problem briefly, right? Which of course goes on to show, for example, 14A versus 14B, it goes on to show that sort of the working memory related integration, both of those things are active simultaneously when we talk about sentence processing, right? I've given this example in Hindi, which is, I must apologize. I guess a lot of speakers might not be in Hindi native speakers, but uh, I thought this is a nice example because it sort of gives you a sense of cost, right? Memory cost, sort of processing cost because of dashed expectation, right? So this sentence, what happens here is that, you know, you have a sentence like वह लड़का, that boy, जिसने who किताब बहुत दिलचस्पी से पढ़ी थी, right? So the boy who book with a lot of interest read, right? My friend is, right? That's the sentence. And what you find is that this is a canonical word order, right? So you have the subject, you have the object, you have the verb, which is read. But what happens is that if you flip the word order in B such that you say subject, and this is of course a adverb. If you say subject, verb, object, right? People are surprised, right? Because, well, people are expecting that, well, Hindi or a language which, for example, which is the languages that are spoken in the subcontinent, all of them have a certain word order, which is SOV. And if I expect an SOV, I better get an SOV. If I get an SVO, then that will create a problem for me. I will basically slow down. That will create certain kinds of issues. And this is in fact what you find there's a slowdown in the non-canonical condition versus the canonical condition. Okay. So very quickly, therefore, what can we say about adult sentence processing? We can say, one, that the sentence processing system is incremental. It relies on multiple sources of information in order to take certain structural decisions. There is working memory limitation, which has, in terms of, for example, decay and similarity based interference, which can lead to problems in a variety of linguistic constructions. And the fact that human sentence processing system is, because it's incremental, we have talked about this, it's therefore also predictive in nature, right? It doesn't it makes certain kinds of prediction about what will arrive in the future, right? This of course means that we make a lot of mistakes. We frequently make a lot of mistakes, and that leads to comprehension difficulty. The key point is that, well, when we make mistakes, of course, we revise things, right? Sometimes we also get fooled into believing certain kinds of things which are not there in the input, right? So there are two kinds of things that we can think about. One is that, well, we get fooled and we sort of correct ourselves, versus we get fooled and we are not able to correct ourselves because we didn't realize we made a mistake, right? Also, both these kinds of mistakes happen. But overall, when these kinds of properties can lead to comprehension difficulty, right? So the question is, right, I'll take some time here, right? Very quickly, I'll try to wrap this up. The question is, well, what about comprehension system for children, right? And by that we mean people, let's say kids who are 4 years old or 5 years old and so on, right? Do they process sentences similar to those of like adults? And if so, and if not, then how do they differ? Right? The quick answer is yes. In fact, a kid of 4 years old is very, very similar to processing a sentence like adult humans. Right? So the answer is yes, children do process sentences similar to adults. So just like adults, children language processing system is also incremental in nature. They also rely on multiple sources of information while, for example, disambiguating Guardpath sentences. And they also make predictions about upcoming material, right? Which is good, right? Which basically means a lot of stuff that we've discussed so far, right, of difficulty and comprehension will hold true most likely for children as well, right? That's important. The other thing is, well, how do they differ, right? One obvious thing which we are very quickly going to basically not spend a lot of time is that, well, reading is going to be slower for kids compared to adults, right? A kid is going to be slower because, well, this entire process of decoding orthographic symbols to linguistic representation is going to be slower in adults, in kids compared to a college going adult, right? So for example, children take longer to read 6-letter words compared to 4-letter words, right? But what is interesting, right, is that children basically, right, while they are, one of the things that is different about, which is relevant for what we are talking about, or what we have been talking about, that when we talk about resolution of ambiguity, children are slow in incorporating multiple sources of information in that process. So for example, right, imagine that the sentence is put the apple on the towel in the box. This is a sentence, right? And so the idea is that, well, when you read this sentence, and if you have an apple on the towel, you have an empty towel, you have a pencil, and you have a box, what adults do is that, well, when they hear such sentences, put the apple on the towel, they take the apple, right, and they put it on the, for example, the towel, right? Or they start looking at the towel if we are measuring the eye. And then they realize, oh, I made a mistake because it's not put the apple on the towel, but it's actually on the towel is not the location for destination, right? But it's actually the location of the apple. And so then they revert back, correct themselves, and then look at the apple and then put it back in the box, right? But if you give the same sentence, put the apple on the towel in the box, if the scene had 2 apples, one apple was on the towel and another was on napkin, then people don't make this mistake of looking at this, treating this towel on the towel as the destination, because they're able to use this extra information about the discourse, or the extra entity which is there in the discourse, to correctly use this sort of information and make the right attachment and go about basically taking the right decision, right? Well, what happens, right, that while adults are able to very quickly make use of this visual context of two apples being there, and therefore, I should quickly you make use of it, children fail to do so, right? Children still end up attaching in this context children still end up attaching on the towel, right, with the verb, right, rather than relating on the towel with apple, right? Which basically means what people have interpreted this as is that children are not able to very quickly use this information in their decision making, right? And they make mistake. And in fact, not only do they make mistake, they're unable to recover. They still basically the meaning that they compute is very different from the meaning that an adult um, computes. Another thing that they are also what has been documented, specifically, is interpretation of pronouns, right? So here is a sentence: the alligator knows that the leopard with green eyes is patting the nurse on the head with a soft pillow, or the alligator knows that the leopard with green eyes is patting himself on the head with a soft pillow, or you can say the alligator knows that the leopard with green eyes is patting him on the head with a soft pillow. These are the three conditions, so to say. Note that when you use himself, it basically refers to leopard. When you use him, it cannot refer to himself. It cannot refer to leopard. So what happens is that when people basically what people did while people when they were listening to these kinds of sentences, right, or attending to these kinds of sentences, around the time when they saw himself, a picture of a leopard was shown, and they had to basically quickly sort of respond to that image, take a decision. And what has been shown is that when the sentence had himself, both adults and children were very fast at basically responding to that image, which is correct, because at himself you need to retrieve leopard in order to establish the relationship between, to establish the fact that, well, himself means leopard, and so that you're activating it again, right? But what happened is some children who had used him, right, in an offline task, because there were two aspects to this experiment. When they were shown the leopard, the picture of a leopard after him, right, they were still very quick in responding to that picture, suggesting that they are relating him to leopard, which is incorrect, right? And adults never did that, right? So it basically means that children at the age of 4 or so are still struggling with pronoun resolution, right? They are unable to basically concretely always, right, uh, relate him to something which is not leopard, which basically is the right way to go about grammatically speaking, right? It's him can never refer to leopard. Similarly, if you have a sentence like Emily went to school with Hannah, she read 10 books. What does she refer to? When you ask adults, most adult will basically say, well, it's Emily, right? That's the intuitive that's the strategy to use. And this is because you could say that, well, adult sort of use the order of the mention, right? And the fact that, well, this is this is a subject, it appeared first, and therefore she will be interpreted using that strategy, right? But children don't seem to be using this kind of a strategy. All right. So this is another very interesting aspect. So it seems that, right? So let me, okay. So, and this is just a very quick point about what are the different kinds of paradigms that people use to investigate processing in children. There's something called the cross-modal picture priming experiment. People use eye trackers to see how, and this is a very widely used paradigm and quite powerful. And of course, people have started using ERP for understanding the processing in children, right? Okay, so let me try and wrap up. The key take home for us is that by the age of 4, children seem to be employing adult-like processing strategies, which is that just like adult, children language processing is also incremental nature. Just like adults, children language processing involves incorporation of multiple sources of information to take decisions when, for example, there is ambiguity in a sentence, for example, local ambiguity in a garden path sentence. But while they do so, they are slow in utilizing this information, to the extent sometimes that they are not able to revise their earlier commitment, right? Which is basically that they're not able to recover from the mistakes that they made earlier. In fact, sometimes they don't even employ certain kind of information at all, right? And in right, which basically which is also related to the fact that in terms of pronoun resolution, they are not utilizing the strategies that adults utilize, right? Um, and finally, for which actually we didn't cover, but you just have to believe me right now that 4-year-old children also make prediction about upcoming linguistic material, which is that they're able to predict what are the kinds of syntactic structures or what kind of patterns will appear in the near future in that sentence, right? So so the idea is that, well, this research is pretty rich, right? And it's telling us a lot of things. Human sentence processing for adults tell us that we make a lot of mistakes. We struggle in understanding sentences. We sometimes make wrong interpretation. And it seems that more or less children will basically struggle in the same way, in addition to, of course, grappling with their own sort of age-related strategies, which are different, which are distinct. And so I think, therefore, it is very important that this research, perhaps selectively, should be used, by teachers while they go about, teaching and using reference, for example. How can pictures and diagrams perhaps can be used in the language that they are using, or those kind of sentences that they're using? And of course, needless to say that they should also perhaps help us in designing textbooks and writing the kind of sentences that we use to to write textbooks and so on. But yeah, so I think this is all I have. I'll stop here, and yeah, I can take questions now.
Samar, there's a question on the chat box. I'll read it out to you, just makes it easier. Do individual differences in children play a role in the rate of language processing and acquisition?
Well, I am not sure about acquisition, I must confess. I will not be able to really give you an answer for that, but I can certainly say that there will be individual differences for language processing. And in fact, when we talked about the pronoun resolution part, there were some kids who were taking the right decisions, right? But there were other kids who were not taking the right decision. Now, the question is, well, what determines this individual difference is, of course, again, an open question, right? And in fact, we don't know a lot about individual differences in adult humans, right? So one way to quantify individual difference in the sentence processing literature is working memory capacity. And there's the distinction between low span and high span readers. And based on that, it has been demonstrated that high span readers basically behave differently in terms of processing compared to low span readers. So if one were to equate that, you would think that surely children will basically differ in their strategy of how they go about comprehending sentences. But I'm not sure if there is a systematic study which is out there. Maybe, yeah, there is. I don't know, frankly.
Okay, there's another question. The question that I posed is a longer one. You can read it later and get back to me. But okay. One from Professor Papi Raju is, in the context of sentences 11 and 12,
yes.
What are the participants actually doing? Grammatical judgment or comprehension?
I see. Let me just go back to see.
Yeah, just go to 11.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, so the original study of Gibson and Thomas was actually grammatical judgment. And what they found was that that 12 was rated as high as 11. So that was the original study. But then subsequently, um, subsequently, what happened was that there was another study which basically replicated this rating, but also did an online study to find the same result, basically. So as far as this study is concerned, or this sort of manipulation is concerned, this SPR and eye tracking have been used to show to demonstrate the difficulty. Hi.
Hi, Samash.
Hi, how are you?
Yeah, so the reason I asked is that most of our spoken language, we don't have facility to go back and correct, right?
Yes.
And most of the time we can be ungrammatical, but we make sense, right? And
Yes.
so we tolerate that in spoken language. And of course, in formal written stuff, there are a lot of things that we discuss. Right.
Yes.
So the other question I had was how much of these constraints and these issues transfer to spoken language understanding?
Correct. That's a very good question, actually. Yeah. In fact, yeah. So you're right. So the answer is that, well, some of this stuff that we are talking about, right, is in fact based on this paradigm which is known as the visual world paradigm. And in the visual world paradigm, people actually hear the sentence auditorily while their eyes are being tracked, right? So I think some of the conclusions that we are making can surely be assumed to be true for both reading as well as spoken language. But I must say that reading will involve or bring in its own strategies, right, which will be distinct from spoken language. But as far as predictability is concerned, as far as incrementality is concerned, and for example, the other aspect of using multiple sources of information while we process does have been shown to be true even with paradigms where you have auditory input.
Yeah. Yeah. So that makes sense. The other reason I asked about spoken language is when it comes to children, the formative years, their training is based on what is spoken. I mean, they will take a longer time to get used to writing and reading, right?
Yes.
So that some of these also get transferred to when they start to read, or benefit when they start to read. Right?
Yes.
Both
No,
ways.
absolutely. And in fact, the paradigms which I've mentioned here, the most naturalistic paradigms which have been used for children, right, in this reading research, is actually auditory in nature, right? So this eye gaze paradigm is really one of the most extensive sort of paradigm, at least in the near past, which basically what happens is that children are hearing something, right, and they are looking at or attending to an image, right, and so that sort of the correlation between what they're hearing and what they're seeing is then interpreted to understand the underlying cognitive process, basically. So it is generally auditory. It has to be with children, yes, because as you can imagine, orthography, decoding, they'll be not very good, obviously. Yes.
Yeah, one last question is that in spoken language, there are extra linguistic cues, right? I mean,
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
That,
absolutely. And in fact, I didn't mention this, but prosody has been shown to be a very important cue when there's ambiguity, right? So prosody is a very important cue to disambiguate. right? And yes, and so the correct, yeah. So that's,
so in that sense, there's an extra dimension that one will have to take in. I mean, the moment you are looking at these issues in spoken language, of course, what is in an experimental scenario, you remove all those and then make it simply a sequence of words without any of the
correct,
extra cues, right? To
correct.
be
No, you're right. You're right. And as far as you're right, absolutely. I think that point is well taken. But having said that, I must say that, like I said, the visual world paradigm is in fact closer to your liking, where the input is in fact auditory. And when that is the case, then you can perhaps, control for these all other aspects, or it's more naturalistic, so to say, right? In that sense, you have a natural sentence which you hear, and then you basically react to that, basically.
Okay.
right.
So,
Okay.
yeah, I think we are like off, time. Thanks a lot, Samar.
Thank
And
you.
there are a lot more questions, I'm sure, in language. There are many, many questions. I think somebody turned on their mic. I'm just going to see if I can get a teacher to ask. Renu, yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Hi. Good evening, Summer. Summer, I want to
Hello.
know, how do we tackle this bilingual, problem which bilingual speakers face? Like, they are neither perfect, or maybe like proficient in like their own language, and equally they are finding it difficult to pick up a second language. So if I have ever need to, like, make an experiment and to pick up the most appropriate from this bilingual speakers, what would be the apt procedure? As you mentioned, is it the prosody paradigm, or how do we go about it? Should I go with the way they speak, like, the narrative discourse, or it should be the written discourse?
um I think there are many questions that you've asked in this. I think the first point is, but as well, so bilingualism, of course, is a lot of issues that we have discussed with respect to uh, uh, for example, memory constraints and so on, has been recently shown to affect bilingual sort of themes in the bilingual sort of domain. So, for example, it seems that if a person is a new learner, right, or early learner of a language of an L2, then the person is more susceptible to certain memory constraints, such as interference and so on, right?
Yeah.
And also their strategy is more shallow, more relying on world knowledge rather than syntax and grammar. But in the context of kids, I suppose we most of the cases will involve students or people who are equally good, or like you are saying, equally bad, I suppose, in both languages. So I don't know. I mean, one will have to think as to what is the question, right? What is one And the best way would be, I suppose, if it's about ambiguity and pronouns and reference resolution and so on, it will be using a methodology which is eye tracking based, right? And that is one way. There are other low cost methods which rely on um, uh, what is called as the multi dual task paradigm, but that has been criticized for some sort of reasons. So I think so auditory input, eye tracking is the right paradigm, which has been shown to be quite effective. But I'm not sure if I can answer you well, because I'm not sure what you're interested in asking, right? Unless we, that has to be, if before one conducts an experiment, one has to narrow down on a specific theme or a specific question in the context of bilingualism to be able to design that experiment, I suppose. Yeah. Sorry if I.
So thanks a lot, Samar. We are kind of running. We're usually running on tight schedules here. Also because we started 6 to 8. There are a lot more questions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to send these questions to you, because they're questions from teachers who are actually teaching in schools. So I'll send this to you, and if you can answer them, I'll send it to you in the chat or something. You can actually answer them. And thanks a lot for the talk. And a lot more questions on language. So next time we are going to have a separate session on language. Next workshop, you're going to be the main host. Okay.
Oh, I don't know about that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. But no, I just volunteered you. Thanks a lot. And next speaker is Vinu. Mr. Srikanth, you can turn this video off, and then we start with the next speaker.